Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, July 25th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Ukraine says that drone attacks on Moscow will increase. So after two drones targeted Moscow early Monday, a Ukrainian military intelligence spokesman warned that such attacks on the Russian capital city will continue and increase in scale in a rare Ukrainian admission of responsibility for attacks inside Russia. So this is spokesman Andriy Yusov. He said this to the Kiev Post. Quote, "The strikes on the key facilities of Russia's security sector located in Moscow testify to the fact that the Putin regime is unable to fully control the sky even for the protection of most important facilities. Obviously, this situation will continue and increase in scale," end quote. So Russian authorities said that the drones were downed with electronic warfare jamming systems, but one of them struck a business center in Moscow, shattering the high-rise building's windows. Moscow's mayor said that there were no casualties in the attack. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova called the drone attack an act of international terrorism. So if you're watching here, you see the picture. This is the damage to the building. You see a few windows were shattered there. So there's also a larger Ukrainian drone attack that was launched on Crimea early Monday, with the Russian Defense Ministry saying that 17 Ukrainian drones were down. So quite a few drones were launched at Crimea. The head of Crimea said that an ammunition depot on the peninsula was hit and a private residence was damaged. So the Biden administration maintains that it does not enable Ukrainian attacks inside Russia, but that restriction does not apply to Crimea, as Washington and Kiev do not recognize the peninsula as Russian territory. The operations, of course, risk a major escalation, especially if Russia believes that the U.S. and NATO are backing these attacks. Russia has previously said that Ukrainian attacks on Moscow are not possible without U.S. support. So that's Russia's view. And the New York Times reported last month that the Biden administration is no longer concerned that Ukrainian attacks inside Crimea or inside Russia might escalate the war. And, kind of their attitude that's basically based on the fact that up to this point, Putin has not responded to these attacks by bombing a NATO base or launching a tactical nuke. That's their reasoning. And as we see this war drag on, we're seeing more and more attacks inside Russia. So there's always this big risk of escalation, especially, again, if Russia views these attacks as supported by the U.S., which U.S. officials have said openly that they do support attacks on Crimea. So, they're really playing with fire here. All right, the next one, U.S. is holding off on giving Ukraine longer-range missiles. So this is some good news, I guess, that we have here. So the Washington Post reported on Saturday that the Biden administration is holding off on sending Ukraine longer-range missiles, citing unnamed U.S. officials. Other recent media reports that I covered said that the administration was moving closer to arming Ukraine with the Army Tactical Missile Systems, the ATACMS, which have a range of up to 190 miles. But U.S. officials said that that was not true and that the U.S. policy on the issue has not changed, and so they're saying we're still not going to send them. The New York Times reported earlier this month that the administration was debating giving Ukraine ATACMS, but according to the Washington Post, U.S. officials said that there has been no discussion about the issue for months, no serious discussion about the issue for months. So providing these ATACMS would be a significant escalation of U.S. support for Ukraine, as they could be fired from the U.S.-provided HIMARS rocket systems and would more than double Ukraine's artillery striking capability. So the UK recently began sending the Storm Shadow missiles to Ukraine, and France is sending their version of those as well. They have a range of 155 miles, but they are air-launched and they can be fired from Ukraine's MiGs. So the ATACMS would give Ukraine a pretty serious increase in range when it comes to artillery. Most of the ammunition that the U.S. is giving them for the HIMARS rocket systems has a range of 50 miles, though the U.S. has also said it's sending missiles with a range of, I believe, 94 miles. But still, either way, it's a big increase, a jump to 190 miles. So the Biden administration has been under pressure from hawks in Congress to send the ATACMS, and Ukrainian officials continue to publicly demand the munitions. ATACMS would give Ukraine the ability to hit targets deep inside Crimea and inside Russia, which would risk a major escalation of the war. But the main, as I said before, they don't really care so much about escalation. The main argument within the administration against providing Ukraine with ATACMS is that they don't have enough. The Pentagon believes it's worried that they would, as the Washington Post put it, severely undercut U.S. readiness for other possible conflicts if they sent these missiles to Ukraine. All right, so the next one here, Zelensky says that the counteroffensive was delayed due to a lack of arms. So Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said in an interview that aired Sunday that the Ukrainian counteroffensive started later than he wanted due to a lack of weapons and training. So Zelensky told CNN's Fareed Zakaria, quote, "We did have plans to start it in the spring, but we didn't because, frankly, we had not enough munitions and armaments and not enough brigades properly trained in these weapons. Still more that the training missions were held outside Ukraine," end quote. So during the lead up to the counteroffensive, which was launched in early June, Ukrainian troops were being trained inside NATO countries. They were being trained in Germany, in the UK, I believe in other countries as well. And Zelensky said that the delay allowed Russia to lay more minefields, which Ukrainian forces have been struggling to push through. Zelensky said, quote, "And because we started it a bit later on, it can be said, and it will be shared truth understood by all of the experts, that it provided Russia with time to mine all of our land and build several lines of defense," end quote. So Russia was, digging in for a long time. When Putin mobilized a few 100,000 troops last fall, in fall 2022, it was basically since then they were reinforcing their defensive lines and really digging in. A lot of people expected Russia to launch an offensive, besides what was going on in Bakhmut, but for Russia to launch a big offensive in the winter, that didn't happen. They just dug in. So Zelensky said the counteroffensive has been at a slower pace due to Russia's minefields and other defenses. He said that Kiev does not want to lose our people, our personnel. So despite the massive amount of weapons and ammunition that the U.S. and its allies have poured into Ukraine, the Wall Street Journal reported over the weekend that Western officials did not believe that Ukraine had enough to dislodge Russian forces. But they were hoping that they would anyway. And as I've been going over, U.S. officials speaking to media outlets are blaming Ukraine's lack of success on their tactics, saying that they're not using the combined arms training that they received from NATO. But, in those first few weeks of the counteroffensive, Ukraine launched a big armor offensive, and they lost a lot of armored vehicles. So now they're, trying to dismantle these minefields using what they call sappers, which are, individual deminers, soldiers that try to demine these areas by hand. So it's, definitely a slow effort. All right. The next one here, this is from Kyle Anzalone over at the Libertarian Institute. Blinken says the Ukrainian counteroffensive could last for several months. So Blinken also spoke to Zakaria on CNN. Secretary of State Antony Blinken told CNN that Ukraine's long-awaited counteroffensive could go on for several months. Kiev launched its operation in early June. Responding to a question about Kiev's progress during the first 6 weeks of its counteroffensive, Blinken said on Sunday, quote, "These are still relatively early days of the counteroffensive. It is tough. The Russians have put in place strong defenses. It will not play out over the next week or two. We're still looking, I think, at several months," end quote. Biden made the remarks after that Wall Street Journal report that I just mentioned, saying, the U.S. saying that the Western officials saying, we knew they weren't prepared, but, we were hoping that they would break through anyway. So that's basically Blinken. He's trying to say, we have to be patient here. It's still going to take a while. But I don't know what he thinks is going to happen at the end of that few months. He's not really making it clear what if he thinks Ukraine can really regain territory, or, what he's really hoping probably is that Ukraine can inflict as much damage to Russia's forces as it can, keep Russia bogged down there. Who cares if thousands of Ukrainian men die in the process? That does not matter to Antony Blinken. All right, the next one here is an interesting one. Liberal Zionists call for ending U.S. aid to Israel. So this is an article from Mondo Weiss from Mitchell Plitnick, and it's about how in the pages of the New York Times, people are calling to end military aid to Israel, which is a pretty big deal. So the damage Israel is causing to its support base in the United States is becoming more apparent. A very bright warning flare went up this weekend, appearing once again in the New York Times. This time it was columnist Nicholas Kristof, who took a much bolder and far less speculative step than his colleague Tom Friedman did last week by suggesting that the very heart of AIPAC's mission, annual military aid to Israel, should be phased out. So Friedman, this is a big deal that Thomas Friedman, if you're familiar with him, huge Zionist, supporter of Israel, liberal, big New York Times columnist, floated the idea of a reassessment of the United States' relationship with Israel. I think that's a bigger deal than Biden saying it. He said that it might be on the horizon. And, that's a big deal, but what was published on Saturday was a bigger deal. Kristof published this and quoted two former U.S. ambassadors to Israel, saying that the U.S. should not give military aid to Israel anymore. And as Plitnick says, it's a liberal Zionist argument for ending military aid to Israel. So Kristof's column strikes at the very heart of the lobbying might of pro-Israel forces and used noted liberal Zionists to do it. Former ambassadors to Israel Dan Kurtzer and Martin Idyk, probably pronouncing that wrong, and they're saying why they think it's a good idea to stop sending billions of dollars in military aid to Israel each year. So Israel gets $3.8 billion each year. And what they're saying is that this doesn't give the U.S., really much influence on Israel's policies. And this is really over the fact that, this judicial overhaul thing is going on. That's what has really upset these liberals. They really don't like the right-wing Netanyahu government that has these extremist settlers and ultra-Orthodox people in the coalition. This is definitely significant. And, we'll see how this all plays out. There might be more growing calls because right now, if you look at Congress, it's only, a few members, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, that have, floated the idea of leveraging military aid to Israel. I believe Bernie Sanders might have mentioned it too, but of course that gets them labeled anti-Semites. And, the vast majority of Congress is still all about giving Israel the support, but you see these cracks are definitely interesting and I think mean something. But again, it's all about this judicial overhaul, not about what Israel is doing with that military aid to the Palestinians. So the next one here, the Israeli Knesset passed a law limiting Supreme Court power. So they had their big vote on Monday, and despite these huge protests, the Israeli parliament passed this new law. So this article is from Middle East Eye. Israel was hit by a political earthquake on Monday as MPs passed a law limiting the Supreme Court's power, one of a raft of judicial reforms critics say are turning the country into an autocracy. Ahead of the vote and after, thousands of protesters in Jerusalem blocked the roads leading to Israel's parliament, the Knesset, with police using water cannons to remove them. Thousands more gathered in Tel Aviv, with protests expected throughout the night. So MPs passed the bill by 64 votes to 0 after opposition lawmakers left the parliament in protest when compromise talks broke down. So this new law abolishes Israel's reasonableness standard, eliminating the Supreme Court's ability to block government decisions that it deems unreasonable. It's part of a package of bills proposed by the government earlier this year, which is seeking to overhaul the judicial system in the country. Proponents of the plan say it's necessary to restore the balance of power between government branches, while opponents say it will remove checks and balances and undermines the independence of the judicial system. These protests are still going on. Tens of thousands of people on the streets. So, there's a lot of unrest going on inside Israel, and the Netanyahu government is still going through with all this. Although Netanyahu is saying that he's still open to, compromise on other aspects of the judicial overhaul. All right, the next one here, the CIA says that it's rebuilding spy networks in China. So the Chinese Foreign Ministry said on Monday that Beijing would take countermeasures in response to the CIA saying that it's making progress on rebuilding spy networks inside China after losing assets in the country over a decade ago. So CIA Director William Burns made the comments last week at the Aspen Security Forum. Burns said, quote, "We've made progress and we're working very hard over recent years to ensure that we have strong human intelligence capability to complement what we can acquire through other methods," end quote. So just openly talking about how the CIA is building up spy networks inside China. And this comes after the CIA has been openly trying to recruit spies in Russia. And Burns recently called the war in Ukraine, this great, how did he put it, once-in-a-generation opportunity for the CIA. So it just seems like very provocative to these countries that you have the CIA chief coming out and just saying this openly. And of course, China responded. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Mao Ning said, quote, "This is rather concerning. The U.S. on the one hand keeps spreading disinformation on so-called Chinese spying and cyber attacks, and on the other hand tells the public about its large-scale intelligence activities targeting China," end quote. She added that China will take measures necessary to safeguard national security. So, according to a report from the New York Times, they reported this back in 2017, but their report said that China broke up an American spy ring by killing or imprisoning more than a dozen CIA sources between 2010 and 2012. In 2018, Foreign Policy reported that the number of CIA assets caught in China in that span of time was more like 30, which is a pretty significant number. And they said that the spy ring was discovered due to a botched communication system. Basically, the CIA was being sloppy with the way they were talking to these assets, and it got them found out, and apparently a lot of them were killed. So the U.S. has been trying to rebuild that, and it's no secret that they are, even before Burns making these comments. Under Burns, the CIA has increased its focus on China by opening a new unit exclusively focusing on the country. CIA officials have said that Taiwan is a top issue for the new China unit. Burns said last week at this Aspen Security Forum that the agency is working to provide early warnings if China ever decides to attack Taiwan. So, again, it's just, something to see him openly talking about this stuff. All right, the next one here, a U.S. submarine docks in South Korea in the latest provocation. No, I'm not repeating a story from last week. This is another U.S. submarine. And this is less than a week after the U.S. sent a nuclear-armed submarine to the Korean Peninsula for the first time since 1981. So this was on Monday, the USS Annapolis, which is a Los Angeles-class submarine. It's nuclear-powered but not nuclear-armed. So a little different. It docked at a South Korean naval base on Jeju Island, and a few hours later, North Korea launched 2 suspected ballistic missiles into the sea off of its coast, so provoking more North Korean missile tests, which, of course, that's going to be the result of this. I just put in a map of South Korea in this story. If people didn't know where this island was, you see it's far south. It looks like it's South Korea's southernmost territory. But the U.S. deployment of a nuclear-armed submarine last week, that also provoked North Korean missile launches. This is just, this situation, and there's no end in sight. The Biden administration has not shown any interest in looking to de-escalate tensions. The U.S., so when we talk about these things, the U.S. sending submarines and bombers, there was a long pause in the U.S. doing these provocations and doing massive war games with South Korea from 2017 to 2022. It was in 2022 that the U.S. started sending bombers again, and then earlier this year, not that long ago, I believe it was back in June, the first time the U.S. openly docked a submarine in South Korea. So now it looks like it's going to be a regular thing. It's the third time within 2 months, second time within a week. So here's just, what's the point of this? Just docking these submarines to say, hey, look, we got a submarine here, and then North Korea fires a few missiles off and, repeat. And, who knows what these tensions could turn into. We're all kind of used to these things happening, even though there was a long lull in these tensions but we're just kind of, Americans, probably don't even really think much when they see these headlines. It's just like, it's North Korea. It's just always happening. But one day, maybe this could spiral into something pretty serious, especially when you got nukes in the mix. You're sending nukes over there. It's crazy. All right, the next one here, Russia says that a U.S. drone nearly collided with a Russian jet, and this is over Syria. This article is, again, from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute, and it continues all these encounters over Syria. So Moscow said that an American drone dangerously approached a Russian fighter jet in Syria and could have caused a collision. The White House and the Kremlin have issued a sequence of statements claiming the other is engaging in confrontational behavior over Syria. So on Sunday, the deputy chief of the Russian Center for Reconciliation of the opposing parties in Syria reported the incident with the drone. He said, quote, of special concern is a near mid-air collision of a coalition's MQ-9 unmanned aerial vehicle with Russian warplanes near Al-Bab. Russian pilots once again demonstrated high professionalism and took timely measures to prevent collisions with the coalition's unmanned aerial vehicles, end quote. So he went on to say that the drones are activating their fire guidance systems on Russian planes, which automatically triggers the fighter jet's onboard defense systems. So this is definitely concerning that there's all these encounters. It's kind of an area most people wouldn't expect as a flashpoint for a war between the U.S. and Russia. Everybody would expect that to happen in Ukraine or the Black Sea or something. But I mean, this could, again, another area that could easily spiral out of control. And that was always the risk of the U.S. continuing this occupation of Syria. You got Russia there, you got Iran there, just a lot of tripwires for war. All right, and another important point with that story is that the U.S. is occupying eastern Syria against the wishes of the government in Damascus. So much for sovereignty when it's in the U.S. If the U.S. wants to do something, those talking points about sovereignty and territorial integrity don't matter. And Russia is an ally of the Syrian government. All right, so the last one here, Spanish newspaper reports that the CIA spied on Ecuador's former president. So this article is from Consortium News, and this is interesting. Spanish private security company UC Global allegedly spied for the United States Central Intelligence Agency on meetings held between former Ecuadorian President Rafael Correa and leaders of several Latin American countries in 2018. El Pais has reported, that's the Spanish newspaper. So according to the paper, the security company spied in particular on Correa's meetings with Argentina's former president, Brazil's former president, and Uruguay's former president. And this information emerged from an examination of the MacBook laptop belonging to David Morales, former military officer and owner of UC Global. So this is the guy who was spying on Julian Assange, the owner of this private security company. And it's pretty clear now that he was doing so at the behest of the CIA. And this was when Assange was in the Ecuadorian embassy. And it was the president at the time, Rafael Correa, who gave him, sorry, I'm blanking on the word here, but he let Assange stay in the embassy. And it looks like the CIA was also spying on him. So this is a big deal because when it comes to the case against Julian Assange, if the CIA, if the U.S. government was spying on Assange and, recording his meetings with lawyers and advocates and everything, I mean, the case against him should be thrown out, you would think. So this evidence should be enough to get it dismissed and get Assange out of jail. But unfortunately, that's not the case. He's still awaiting, I guess, the appeal of the extradition decision from the UK. But this, should be very important to that case. So hopefully, more and more revelations about this guy, David Morales, and his company leads to the courts in the UK deciding that, there's been too much, U.S. spying on him to extradite him. But, unfortunately, I don't expect the British to make the right decision on this. All right, that's it for the news for today. Asylum, that's what he granted Assange asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy. I don't know why I couldn't think of that word. But that's it for the news. Go check out our Viewpoints. We have one from Ted Snyder. If you don't want to be treated like Amazon, don't promise to be like Amazon. One from Jonathan Grodenfeld, using Ukraine as cannon fodder. One from Mark Curtis, how the UK media misled about Britain's leading military think tank. That's at Declassified UK. One from Connor O'Keefe at the Mises Institute, the media and Ukraine war coverage where truth takes a holiday. And also one from Connor Eccles at Responsible Statecraft, what Oppenheimer leaves out. And this is a really good story about the Oppenheimer movie, about how it does not cover the victims of the first nuclear test in New Mexico and how the people that lived that have had to deal with the radioactive fallout, got cancer and everything, that wasn't mentioned in the movie apparently. And speaking of Oppenheimer, if you go into our blog, we posted, as I mentioned yesterday, The Truth About Oppenheimer, which is a documentary series from Pat McFarlane at the Libertarian Institute. This is part 1, and it's about 30 minutes long, but it's really disturbing. It's about how Manhattan Project scientists secretly injected American citizens with lethal doses of plutonium, which I also don't think was in the movie. I haven't seen the movie. I got to go see it and see what they did, but it's 3 hours long, so I don't know if I'm going to be able to make the time to go to the movies, so I might have to wait to stream it. But if you have seen it, let me know what you think. I'm curious. But that's everything for me for today. You could always support us at antiwar.com/donate. Like and subscribe on YouTube, Odyssey, Rumble. Share the show. All that stuff really helps out. Follow us on Twitter. But again, I appreciate all the support, all the comments. I'll be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.